So, like, if I said to you, Joe, you believe everything you've heard about Alexander the Great, right? You believe it. You know, he's fought in these battles. What they say, you just believe it's Alexander the Great. I'll read his biography. You'd say, yeah, sure. But then you'd be like, oh, but I don't believe they made it up about Jesus. Okay, Alexander the Great, because what you'll always hear is, well, the Gospels were written 100+ years after Jesus died. Alexander the Great's first biography was written like 300 years after he died.
There's some people who say it like that.
Yeah, somewhere my wife is going, ugh.
We've talked about the historical accounts of Jesus quite a bit on this show. And if you're not a Mug Club member, often Gerald Captain Morgan here will do apologetics episodes. And Distefano was on Joe Rogan, and he was discussing clearly a book that he had recently read, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Interesting book. I wouldn't say it's the strongest book out there in making the historical case for Christ, but it's not a bad place to start. Joe Rogan has evolved a little bit, it seems, in his views on Jesus Christ. And it's one of those things where we're not all going to agree. But truth is not subjective. And so you need to start with a historical case, the historical accounts case. Is there some common ground truth on which we can agree? Historically, meaning up until, I would say, the 1980s or 90s, people agreed on the historical figure of Jesus Christ. Just a lot of people didn't agree on the divinity. All right. This is discussed with Joe Rogan, and some points are made. We just wanted to spend a little bit more time on this. Let me know if you've seen this below, because a lot of people are sounding off in the comments, and unfortunately it then lends itself to fake news. Then there are jump cuts that are being uploaded to Instagram and TikTok, and they're addressing claims that weren't even made. So the references are available, link in the description, and we want to hopefully help clear up. It really gets my goat is the fake news out there now. It's gotten so bad so quickly. Here, we'll go through this point by point. Here is Distefano actually using the historical comparison, which we have on this show, to Alexander the Great.
So, like, if I said to you, Joe, you believe everything you've heard about Alexander the Great, right? You believe it. You know, he's fought in these battles. What they say, you just believe it's Alexander the Great. I'll read his biography. You'd say, yeah, sure. But then you'd be like, oh, but I don't believe they made it up about Jesus. Okay, Alexander the Great, because what you'll always hear is, well, the Gospels were written 100+ years after Jesus died. Alexander the Great's first biography was written like 300 years after he died.
There's some people who say it like that.
Yeah, somewhere my wife is going, ugh.
Is that an accent thing?
She hates that. I hate it too.
Jesus?
It's Jesus.
Why do people say that?
I don't know.
Maybe they learned it from the song, Jesus loves me.
Jesus.
Yes, I know.
You can say it correctly, even in the song.
I think he's not saying it incorrectly. It's just
a different way of saying it.
It's the wrong point to focus on. I'll say it.
Sorry.
But this is something, too, that you've talked about quite a bit, that a lot of people say, well, I don't agree on the historical accounts or that Jesus is a historical figure.
Yeah.
Alexander the Great is a good comparison because there's no one refuting the idea that he existed.
Correct.
But there are far more historical accounts and closer to the time of Jesus than Alexander the Great.
Yeah, and so we've actually got a chart here just quickly. Most people don't understand like what you're saying. So pull that chart up really quickly. So this just gives you an idea. I've had this thing for I think like 15 years. Let's just use Caesar, right? So this is talking about when these things were written about Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, right? But the earliest actual copy that we have of those writings is from 900 AD. That's a 1,000-year gap between when these documents were written and the earliest copy that we even have. And we only have 10 of them to be able to look and cross-reference and go, is this person telling the story correctly? If you look at that chart and go down this list, you would have just assumed like, oh, Caesar, we have a bunch of stuff that's within like 10 years of when Caesar was around. No, we have something from 1,000 years after it was written. That's a really, really big deal. Go down to the New Testament we're talking about here. Those things were written between AD 50 and 100. People that were actually around at the time of Christ were writing those books. And people were referenced in those books as saying, and some of you were around and saw Jesus as well. So it was referring to people there. We have earliest copies from AD 125. That's a 25-year gap between the earliest copies that we have and when the books were written. And we have over 24,000 copies so that you can make sure what you're reading is accurate. So if you're going to accept a 1,000-year gap and 10 copies to make sure that we know what Caesar was all about, you have to then go, well, that makes sense. Then I would accept that the New Testament that we have today is what was written.
Right.
This is what they actually said.
Right.
So that just makes the point very clearly that most people don't realize that those gaps exist for other historical figures they take for granted.
Also, by the way, what ends up happening often is we find new artifacts. We find new historical documents.
Exactly. There's a lot of stuff that you can find to confirm archaeological evidence, to confirm a lot of this stuff as well.
And I talked with Joe Rogan a long time ago about, and I wasn't planning on it when I was on a show, I believe in 2015. He kind of decided to veer the conversation towards Jesus. And back then he was not, I would say, as receptive to the idea. I believe he referred to him as a fictional character or imaginary friend or something like that, which was fine. It's pretty, okay, funny. We disagreed, but I didn't point to Alexander the Great. You can go and watch it. A really, really important example is, King David in the Bible, because that was a huge argument for people against
they didn't
historical
think the
account.
Davidic kingdom existed.
They didn't think that it existed.
Because there was no evidence.
And I discussed that with Joe Rogan. To give you some reference here, 2015.
Is there a possibility of a miracle, which you require for the Big Bang, and I require for
I don't necessarily
someone returning
think
from the
I
dead?
require a miracle for the Big Bang. I think there's missing science. I think that there's first of all,
there's missing evidence from the a good example, right? This argument you're using right now.
Okay.
I want to get because I'm not a theologian.
What
I'm
is
not an
the
apologist.
what argument?
But an
though?
argument that was used for a long time is kind of what you're using. There's no proof of this. Well, for the longest time, people said because David was this huge influential historical figure, right? And they're going, well, David, up until 1993, they're going, this is a guy, this giant kingdom, right? This is the guy. There should be some historical evidence. And there's none. Until 1993, boom, more evidence than you could possibly imagine on David, his name on Marblestone. Here is David. Here is his kingdom. As a historical figure, now nobody denies that he existed.
And the point that we're going to discuss it is that, an absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence at that point in time.
Yeah.
Now, you can't use it as an argument. In other words, you can't say, well, it could happen, but you can point to previous examples, as with David, and say, we thought this for a long time, and then the argument shifts. And they go, yeah, well, what about, and they'll insert a new argument here. That was kind of fundamental for people who denied the historical accuracy or corroboration of the Bible because of how big of an impact someone like David would have had.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would think that there would be some evidence of his kingdom if it was that influential and it was that big and it was that, impressive and all that stuff. And it just turns out we hadn't found it yet. So that's a really good point. Sometimes you just haven't found the evidence for this yet. Now, you can't use that and be like, well, you just never found the evidence, for something.
Right.
And just say that it exists. But we did find the evidence for it. We did have historical writings. The Bible is a historical book as well. So it doesn't just get completely disregarded because maybe you're not a Christian. But let me just say this without diving into this. You are 100% correct. He does rely on a miracle for the Big Bang. I know that's going to piss a lot of people off, and they're going to be like, oh, my gosh, we're going to talk about that? No, we're not going to go down that road. But I'm just saying, it's not like, well, I'm just waiting on further science. Okay, well, then I'm waiting on further evidence. You can make that argument on both sides. No, you're depending on a miracle just like I'm depending on a miracle. Let's just talk about the miracles.
Right.
Right? I think it was a really good point that he tried to skirt past.
Well, I think, that's a good point that you're making. There's an absence of the science right now. We're waiting on it. You're waiting on some more historical evidence. Yeah, that's effectively where you are. And we want to get to the point here where they discuss something very common, where you often find yourself at this impasse. Okay, if you accept Jesus Christ as a historical figure, okay, you accept these accounts, you acknowledge that there's stronger corroboration of the accounts, I should say, of Jesus Christ, but then you say, I don't believe in the resurrection. That's where we're going to get to here. But first, let's go through this point by point. Distefano, I believe in the next clip, is talking about the Gospels and the timeline. He's close to there, but again, this is not someone who's a theologian. I really do appreciate him making the effort.
Yes, the Gospels were 70 years later, but they were based off the accounts of people who were living at that time and up to like 25 years after it. And they say, oh, well, a game of telephone. I can tell you something goes around the room, telephone. By the time it gets to me, 10 people, what you just said is irrelevant. It's a totally different thing. I get it. But what they said is because of that ancient thing of, kind of having to pass down these Old Testaments because they couldn't write, it would be like if you're playing a game of telephone, but every person, I check with the person before to make sure the word I'm saying is right.
I agree with what he's saying, but I think he's saying it in a way that is unnecessary because you're saying that, the game of telephone, you can't know exactly what they were saying. And he's talking specifically about Jesus in the New Testament. We don't have to depend on that. You're talking about people who were there that wrote it. That's who we're talking about. We're not talking about people who are like, hey, I was never a part of any of this. I was never even around anybody who was there. I didn't hear the stories even secondhand, even though I wasn't there. It was like, well, no, I was there. I saw this. I did this. Jesus said this. Jesus did that.
Right.
Like those are the kinds of records that really we have for the New Testament. So I thought his point was a little like off the mark there for it, but I understand what he's saying. It's a culture that is built on passing down history orally. Right. And so that culture is obviously going to be different than ours, which is built on passing history down in written form, right? In video form. We don't have to be able to remember.
If it was a game of telephone, the Bible would be really dirty. It would. Because telephone always ends up dirty.
It does.
In my experience.
That's how a 33-year-old teacher ends up sleeping with a 17-year-old boy. I mean, it just happens. Game of telephone.
No, that's the game of sending pictures of my boobs with my telephone.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
a different game of telephone. Okay,
And it's really not. It's your
Got it.
hand computer. It's not really a telephone at this point in time.
It's just an app on it.
Yes.
It is.
Here is Joe Rogan trying to make the point that this could actually just be seen as confirmation bias.
That's a little bit of confirmation bias because the real problem is like who said it originally.
So what?
And who decided what the words were originally?
Okay, that I get that, which is true. But just for Jesus, this book was saying that the reason why they believe the historical accuracy of it is because his haters and the disciples were both saying the same thing.
Right. So that's called enemy attestation. Typically, if you're like, for example, if you wanted to act like I didn't exist, Stephen, like you killed me, and then you came on the show one day and
listening.
I'm just not here. You wouldn't say, Gerald's no longer with us. You would just act like nothing happened. And then when somebody's like, hey, where did Gerald go? You'd be like, Gerald who?
Yes.
Like he doesn't exist. So enemy attestation is basically saying like the Romans were the enemies of Jesus because he started things that messed up their kingdom, right? They were causing trouble specifically to Pilate and his rule there. Like,
basically a revolt.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically a revolt.
Usurper,
and
right?
the Romans would have had a vested interest in saying,
Yes.
Jesus what? Jesus who? Or trotting out the body, right?
Right.
They could say, Jesus, we have no idea who he is. Or, okay, all right, sure. Well, we crucified Jesus. Look, he's dead. This is your God. They didn't do that. They said, sure, okay. Yeah,
was
Jesus,
this guy
we
named
killed him, and
Jesus.
he's not there, but, and then that's where the paths diverge.
Right, exactly. So he's basically saying like, hey, everybody so far is saying the same thing. Even the Jews. Like there's this guy Jesus, he's claiming to be the Messiah. That's what they said. And he's leading this revolt. And the Romans are like, yeah, there's this guy named Jesus, and he was doing this thing with some people about the way or the Christianity thing. We later said Christianity. First it was called the way. And he's kind of leading this thing over there. So everybody so far is on the exact same page. Jesus is there at that time doing the things that they're saying he's doing. Period. Pretty easy.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Okay. Now let's move on to Distefano talking about the resurrection.
A big thing is the resurrection, right? People say, really? He f***ing resurrected from the dead? And you're like, well, everybody agreed, haters, Romans, and the Jewish people, everybody agreed he died. That's 100%. That's why when they stab him and they say water came out, it wasn't water, it was fluid from his lungs because he was dead. And that's what would happen to you or I when we die, is we have this lung fluid that comes out. So that's what they said, oh, that's water. And that's what they made him divinity. But it was like a natural thing. He's dead. Everyone agrees. And you say, well, they buried him in a tomb. And then the next day, or 3 days later, the tomb's empty. And people are like, so, you know, that made up. And they say 500 people saw him in the town. Romans and Hebrew, they saw him over the next couple of weeks. 500 independently sourced people, real, like corroborated, 500 people saw him.
This one is frustrating to me because the theory that the tomb was empty because people stole the body, you don't understand what happened in Rome, right? So if you remember, the Jews went to him and they put the sign on the cross and everything, and it really pissed the Jews off. Dig into why that pissed them off, because basically it was the Yod-He, Vav-He, basically saying that it was God. It was basically like Pilate's way of digging at them. But the one thing that he did do was like go and make this as secure as possible, because the Jews expected his disciples to steal the body and claim a resurrection because Jesus said that he was going to rise again in 3 days, right? They knew this was coming. They posted guards and they sealed the tomb. Right? So I don't remember if it was like a string or something like that, but it's sealed in such a way that if it was opened, they would know. And also the guards were guarding it under penalty of death. If somebody got past them and stole the body, the guards would be killed.
Right.
Were they
The guards
killed?
have a vested interest in saying, nobody shall pass.
Right.
Like, I will die otherwise. There's no record of them being killed, Josh, to answer your question. But if you are Rome and your job right now is to go, this guy doesn't exist, here's what you do. You go in, You take the body under cover of night and you move it somewhere else, and that's the story that you tell people, but you never tell them where you moved it. I moved this body because we knew you guys were going to come and do some shenanigans and try to say that he's the Messiah and risen from the dead, and now he's your king, and now Rome can go to hell, right? That's what we did. We moved the body. You're never going to know where it is, but this guy is dead and gone. They didn't say that. They secured the tomb as best they could, and then this guy rose from the dead. There is no way to get out of it otherwise. There is no swoon theory. He was wrong. Not everybody believes Jesus died. Islam kind of says he just swooned.
That's true.
You know, he got stabbed in the side and he got beaten to death, basically, but otherwise he was just fine and just needed a...
Well, that's a problem with ever saying 100%.
Yes.
Everybody, absolutely. But that just comes, with experience in this subject. But yeah, Islam is based on blasphemy. It's based on the idea that Jesus is not was not actually executed and is not who he says he is. So when Muslims get really mad about a cartoon, I say, well, entire religion based on blasphemy. And you know what? We roll with it. We say, it's not my time in hell.
it.
So a few hundred people saw him in town.
Over 500 people.
So what's the counter theory then? The counter theory is Weekend at Bernie's, or
Well, I think we have another clip here.
Matthew and Mark are just like, hey, this is my friend Christ. Look at him. Doesn't he look great?
And he's like, boy, I had a rough weekend.
Oh, this crown of thorns is falling off. Put that back up there, Jesus.
I feel better. Yes. Like, hey, Jesus, do it like we rehearsed. These are good people. Let's go. I think he addresses this, or they sort of address the robbery theory in this clip.
The other conspiracy theory is like, well, the disciples robbed his body. The disciples just robbed his body because they didn't want him. They would hand over crucifixion victims to like the wild dogs. That used to be the way it was. If you got crucified, throw you in a pit, wild dogs will eat you, or leave you on the cross, birds will eat you. That's how we deal with you. So they're like, that's why they were taking his body. And then you see that, well, that's probably not what happened. And the Romans themselves acknowledge there's no body in that tomb that we put in there 3 days ago. The body is not there, and we did it. So in order to save ourselves, we're going to say the apostles robbed it. But in reality, that's just a conspiracy because the apostles would have no reason to rob it.
Okay, so we kind of just addressed that point. Yep. But this brings us to the final point where I think there was I guess there was a misconnection. And I've perused the comments, and you have some people who are sounding off, and a lot of people are getting it wrong. Some people are getting it right, where I think it's this reflex sometimes that you'll see from Joe. And I appreciate that he's open-minded and he's being more receptive, I would say now than he used to be. But the idea that, well, hold on a second, why are you saying that? Why are you saying conspiracy? And he uses that word, and I think it's important. Just keep in mind there's a huge difference between conspiracy, which, by the way, there can be a provable, verifiable conspiracy. Let me just give you the definition before I show the clip. The definition of conspiracy is an act of conspiring together, meaning two or more people. That's different from a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is a theory that explains an event or set of circumstances as a result of a secret plot by usually powerful co-conspirators. Okay, there's a difference between the two. Conspiracy versus conspiracy theory. So let's go to Joe Rogan right here and just see if you can spot it.
So the Romans think the apostles robbed the body.
That's a conspiracy.
Why do you say conspiracy?
Well,
you're saying a conspiracy to diminish the story.
No. I meant conspiracy in the sense of that's what people say as a reason why the
Did the Romans say that?
The Romans have said that. The Romans said that back then, and then I guess conspiracy is the wrong word because I'm not like it's one story, one explanation. I'll say explanation of.
But if you looked at it like, what's the most logical explanation? Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life? Or the most logical explanation that someone took his body, because that's what the Romans said?
Because I'm saying that is that
came back to life.
One time.
Or just,
I'm not saying
that's
crazy
good right
about
there.
I'm just saying, you know what? After reading that book.
So where he says there, is it crazier to believe that a dead guy came to life, or that because the Romans said it? All right. And I understand the basis for this, but it becomes it becomes a self-defeating premise. That's an outlandish claim. It requires evidence of the outlandish claim, right? You're the one making the claim that someone was resurrected. Okay, that's true. That is an abnormal event.
Yep.
And so the implication there is, why wouldn't you believe the Romans, right? The Romans must have better historical records. The Romans must prove historically more reliable. Okay, let's go with that. let's assume it's not necessarily correct. For example, we have very little corroborating documents on Caligula, even though it's funny, the stuff that we do have. Let's go with it being more historically accurate. All right, so then we have the Romans saying, okay, he was crucified. Okay, he died. All right, the body's not there. So let me ask you what's more outlandish. People who claim to have seen this man, right? Like you said, hundreds of people who claim to have seen this man after he was dead, which is a fact according to the Romans and historical accounts themselves. Okay, who believe that and are willing. Am I hearing something here in the studio? Is it like a television on or something?
Nah, I think it's just audio out there.
Oh, okay. People who are willing to believe that and die for what they believe to be a supernatural event, willing to die for someone who they see as the Messiah. Is that more outlandish? Because we also have documentation that they died. Or people knowingly lying, stealing a body, and then being subjected to torture, skinning alive, boiling, crucifixion, being thrown off a roof for what they know to be a lie. To me, that's more outlandish, that people would conspire, because either way, there's some kind of conspiring. Either the Romans conspired because they were dealing with some kind of a revolt and they were trying to quell an uprising. They conspired to say, all right, they actually stole the body, because there's no disagreement from both camps here as far as Jesus being crucified and dying. So the Romans conspired to say they stole the body, or when you're talking about the disciples, they conspired to create a fake Messiah with no financial gain or incentive of their own, and were willing to die horrible deaths knowingly for a lie. People will lie to get themselves out of torture and death. They don't typically lie to jump into a boiling pot.
That's right. That's a really bad brochure, too. Like,
yes.
Come with us. You will have no money, no place to lay your head. Most people will want to kill you. And we know that this is a lie.
Yes.
Like, all of this is a lie, and you guys should just do this. It doesn't make any sense at all. There's a book called The Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, very famous guy. And it is all of the evidence related to Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection, and just pulling evidence like from outside. It's the medical part of it as well that's described in the Bible, one of the most in-depth medical kind of descriptions of a crucifixion or a public execution that we've ever had in history, which is very, very interesting because you have a lot of details you confirm there, but nobody dies for a lie that they know is a lie. And you can't really argue your way out of that. There's no real way to do that. Josh McDowell, thank you very much for Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Because you can't say, well, they knew it was a lie, but they thought maybe this guy was going to rise again at some later point. No, the Jews were expecting a conquering king. They got the suffering servant part first. They weren't waiting around for somebody to resurrect. It was a surprise to them all the way up to the day that he rose from the dead and showed himself to the disciples, by the way. All of them.
Right.
Saw Jesus resurrected. They would have known either A, he actually showed himself to us and he's the real deal, so let's go do this thing and it doesn't matter if we get killed, or B, he's still dead and we stole his body to make it look like we have something, but it's still not playing in our favor because people hate us and persecute us. They would not have done the lie part. Eventually, they would have fallen away and gone into nothing.
And by the way, this is also not anything new. So Joe was saying, like, well, you just say it's a conspiracy because of the Romans. And people will present the case, right? Christian apologists, they tend to be pretty good at this because they've gotten a lot of reps, not only currently, but historically. So just because the Romans say it, well, again, we have to go back to why would people willingly die, be tortured, suffer for what they know is a lie? But the reason that Christians have been more effective at justifying and rationalizing their faith than any other religion in the history of the world. That's when people say, well, we could just point to similar examples from Egyptian mythology, the idea of resurrection. We could point to, no, and I mean take all of them. You have not had followers, disciples, as good at the apologetics portion of spreading their faith. Why? Because people have done this for a very long time. They've been very dismissive, and they say that's absolutely not true. And they've also executed and persecuted Christians, and it still has always been spread by word of mouth. The spread of Christianity has required its advocates to say, okay, hold on a second. I understand that you're dismissing this, saying, oh, some guy raised from the dead, or you're saying flying spaghetti monster, or you're going to kill me if I tell you that I believe this to be true. So allow me to explain to you why I know this to be true. So even though there were known persecutors of Christians throughout history, Christianity, early Christianity, was not spread by the sword. It was spread through speech. it was spread through word of mouth. Very different from the early days of Islam, where there were no known actual oppressors. And it was exclusively spread through violence across that entire area of the world. So Christians have had to get pretty good at this because it's the only religion that has faced direct persecution, execution for centuries without an actual standing army. How do you grow it? You have to convince people. And that's what you're seeing today. And that is why, to me, it's a self-defeating premise, because these people did it knowingly facing execution, and they were willing to use their words. If you want to know why freedom of speech is so important, just look to the initial spread of Christianity. That's why.
Yeah.
All right. Anything?
No.
Okay.
I think it's pretty good. I'm glad he was willing to share his story, though, the comedian.
I really
He's
a funny guy, too. I recommend people go. He's very, some of his stand-up is hilarious.
Yeah, and I mean, look, you might be like, you're talking about Jesus. Look, it's the most important decision you'll make. Either it's the biggest waste of time and you should absolutely never listen to anybody talk about Jesus again, or it's going to affect every single thing in your life. There is no in between. And making the case historically, and making the case from the books that we have available, like making just a purely historical case for Jesus, his existence, and the potential claims. God didn't ask you to check your brain at the door. He basically said, go and search these things out and see if all of this stuff is true. And I think that's an important part of what we do. But it's also kind of fun to hear somebody do it on Joe Rogan. I
also understand the skepticism. We get it. Yeah. Some stories don't hold up.
Weirdo! That's right, they pee stronger than us, and STD can turn them into zombies. See, read all about it.
They're zombies, they're sucking the blood.
That's absolutely right. Had a girlfriend like that once.
Oh, I knew her too.
Never again.
Well, I did twice.
What?
There she is now.
Cicadas are blood-sucking zombies?
Yeah.
What?
Basically.
It's a real thing.
No.
Basically, and they burrow and live underground like a coffin.
And they disappear
That's
for
a vampire.
years.
Apparently there's three different kinds of cicadas that are like all coming out at one time right now.
Oh,
Ginger
wow.
Snap, Lane the Brain was talking about that. He said the world was going to end.
You know what
I
they
didn't
call-
quite say that, but
You know what they call cicadas?
what?
Nature's meteorologists.
Really? Also nature's zombies.
Yeah,
apparently.
that's
So
true. Need some
Terrifying creatures, too, by the way.
They really are absolutely
how are they?
terrifying.
I don't think they do anything to you, but they just
Basically.
feel scary.
Yeah, they do. They feel scary. There's a lot of bugs like that.
I don't think it does anything to you, though.
There was a bug in the office here. It's in the Southwest that curls up, almost like a bug, but it's like an armadillo. What is that?
It's
You guys
a
call it-
doodle bug.
And I put a bug in your phone.
It's a doodle bug.
It's a different thing.
That's what we found out.
I'm working on a expose for the Post.
All right, we want to get to the ice.
Wow.
Get in line.
Yeah. Watch Slider with Crowder live Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern.